Should COVID-19 vaccines be mandatory? Drug makers are edging closer to releasing vaccines to help control the virus, but surveys suggest some people aren't willing to take the shot. The health crisis has largely grounded the global aviation industry. The head of Australia's national airline, Qantas, says vaccines should be mandatory for international travel as soon as they become available. Alan Joyce says passengers may be asked to show proof of inoculation.
We are looking at changing our terms and conditions to say for international travellers that we will ask people to have a vaccination before they can get on the aircraft. What do you need that domestically? We'll have to see what happens with COVID-19 in the market, but certainly for international visitors coming out and people leaving the country, we think that's a necessity.
But it now appears fewer people are willing to be vaccinated. In August, a World Economic Forum survey across 15 countries found 77% of people would get a COVID-19 vaccine. That's now down to 73%. A third of those surveyed are worried about potential side effects and say clinical trials are happening too fast.
Schützen diese Impfstoffe tatsächlich?
We don't know whether these vaccines provide a long-lasting protection. Do they protect against serious cases? We don't need a vaccine which prevents a mild cough and a mild fever. We need a vaccine which prevents serious cases like pneumonia. Whether they can do that is totally unclear, and approval procedures did not take that into account at all.
I'm not planning to take the vaccine because it is too many questions about why. We're just reading it, what's going on with the vaccine and who is going to take it to be immune.
I don't want to be vaccinated at all, but possibly I would have chosen the Russian vaccine if I wanted to. But at the moment, I did not even think about it. Much depends on a person's immunity, I guess. Maybe someone needs it, but this is a personal choice, I believe.
Some world leaders, including Britain's Prime Minister, insist people won't be forced to take the shot.
Let's be clear, there will be no compulsory vaccination. That's not the way we do things in this country. We think it's a good idea. And I totally reject the propaganda of the anti-vaxxers. They're wrong. Vulnerable people, people who need a vaccine should definitely get a vaccine, and everybody should get a vaccine as soon as it is available, according to the advice of the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. We should be very, very pro-vaccine.
Let's bring in our panel. In St. Louis, in the US, Dr. Matish Lakawayo-Davis, an infectious disease physician at Washington University School of Medicine. In Johannesburg, Shabir Mehdi, professor of vaccinology at the University of Witwatersrand and a member of the South African Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID-19. And in London, Oksana Pisak, a senior lecturer and global health advisor at University College's London School of Pharmacy. A warm welcome to you all. I'd like to begin in the US with Dr. Davis. We hear so much about people being concerned, frightened, suspicious of taking vaccine, commonly known as the anti-vaxxers. But we also are talking about perhaps making COVID-19 mandatory to take once it has all its approvals. Do you think mandatory is the way forward? Is that the way to go?
I think given the current climate we find ourselves in the United States and the difficulty we've had after 9 months in getting standardized leadership and therefore for the public to follow the public health guidance, it will be very difficult to mandate this vaccine without a lot of pushback. Unfortunately, this has become a highly politicized issue. And so mandatory, in my mind, will make half the population feel like their freedoms are being encroached upon.
But this is a public health issue. Surely it's up to the government to be able to try and explain this properly and suggest guidelines, if not making it mandatory, but at the very least saying, please, this, if we want to get out of this, we do need to take this vaccine.
Absolutely. But as you know, the timing couldn't be worse. We're currently in somewhat of a leadership vacuum, being that President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris will not be in power until February. And even then, they will be starting from the beginning with a country that is divided. So although this is clearly a public health issue and should have been treated as such for the last 9 months, The current surveys show that, again, the country is split in this way. And the reason I believe we haven't been able to get this under control in a meaningful way is because of inconsistencies in that way. And those of us in the medical and public health officials having to battle this now politicized issue.
Oksana Pisak in London, it is a politicised issue, certainly in the UK. Even the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has been speaking about whether it should be mandatory to take the vaccine or not. Do you think mandatory is the way forward?
Well, Boris Johnson and his government in the UK have made it clear that they will not be pursuing a mandatory policy around vaccination. And historically, that has been challenging as well. If we can galvanize communities, if we have consistent messaging from the government around the safety of vaccines, if there's that transparency, that's going to have far more positive effect in public trust. However, currently, it's not just the US that's facing this wave of polarization. And we see that globally there is a shortage of trust. And that feeds into these perceptions around whether we will want to use certain tactics to boost vaccination rates. The other issue to also take into consideration here is that people who are vaccine hesitant will be doing their own research about this vaccine, and they'll go across the internet and find all sorts of conflicting sources of information, non-verified accounts of adverse events, and then that may feed into their beliefs around vaccines. So misinformation, and being in this age of social media, more of big tech also needs to get involved, step up into their roles in terms of flagging misinformation, things that are not factual. So it has to be government alongside technology companies, social media, as well as our pharmacists, physicians working with communities to communicate the value of vaccines. I think actually if we take that approach versus mandatory, it might be more effective.
So it's all about information and getting the information out there. Oksana, I just want to bring in our guest in Johannesburg here, Shabir Mehdi. Now, Shabir, it's slightly different when it comes to the case of South Africa and other poorer nations, because the rich nations already have placed orders for these vaccines. And the US and the EU and the UK have massive orders already placed. But in a country like South Africa, which has a challenging financial situation, it's not a case of whether the vaccine should be mandatory or not. It's a case of whether you can actually get the vaccine.
Exactly. I wish that we were having the discussion about whether it should be mandatory or not in Africa in general. As you correctly point out, the big challenges that we face is an issue of the timeliness of being able to access at least a reasonable quantity of vaccine at an affordable price. And that is the real challenge that we face in Africa. And it really goes back to what we experienced in 2009 as an example, with the swine flu. In that the only country on the entire African continent to eventually receive swine flu when the pandemic was present was South Africa. And in fact, it only received a limited quantity after the pandemic had passed.
An ambush 80 kilometers east of the Iranian capital. Armed assailants opened fire on this car, killing Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, considered to be one of the architects of Iran's nuclear program. So far, no one has claimed responsibility, but Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif and other Iranian officials were quick to point the blame at regional foe Israel.
Terrorists murdered an eminent Iranian scientist today. This cowardice, with serious indications of Israeli role, shows desperate warmongering of perpetrators.
Fakhrizadeh was one of Iran's top nuclear scientists, believed to be the leader of the country's covert atomic bomb program, Project Ahmad, which was shelved in 2003. But Israel and its ally, the United States, have long accused Iran of trying to secretly restart the program, with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu even singling out Fakhrizadeh as a key player.
A key part of the plan was to form new organizations to continue the work. This is how Dr. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, head of Project Ahmad, put it. Remember that name, Fakhrizadeh.
His assassination is likely to heighten regional tensions and further strain Iran's tense relationship with the United States. Outgoing US President Donald Trump's administration pulled out of a 2015 deal with Iran in which they agreed to curb their nuclear program in return for an easing of economic sanctions. President-elect Joe Biden has vowed to rejoin the unraveling accord, but Friday's assassination will likely complicate the situation. Israel and the US have not commented on Fakhrizadeh's assassination, but Donald Trump did retweet an Israeli journalist's tweet that called his death a major psychological and professional blow for Iran.
The aftermath of the killing. Bullet holes in a car and blood on the floor. Injured in the attack, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was taken to hospital, but later died. He had been one of Iran's most senior nuclear scientists and had already survived a previous assassination attempt.
Based on the report made by the guard, first they opened fire at his car, then after 10 to 15 seconds a truck carrying explosive materials exploded near his car. Gunfire continued after the explosion.
Officials admit his death is a blow to the country's defense program.
All of Iran's enemies should well know the people of Iran and those in charge of this nation are braver than to let this criminal action go without a response. In the right time, a response to this crime will be given. And likewise, the people of Iran are wiser than to fall in the trap of the Zionist conspiracy.
The Israeli Prime Minister had named Fakhrizadeh in 2018 as the director of Iran's nuclear weapons program.
A key part of the plan was to form new organizations to continue the work. This is how Dr. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, head of Project Ahmad, put it. Remember that name, Fakhrizadeh. So here's his directive. It's right here. And he says, the general aim is to announce the closure of Project Ahmad, but then he adds, special activities, you know what that is, special activities will be carried out under the title of scientific know-how developments.
Previous assassinations of 4 Iranian scientists between 2010 and 2012 have also been blamed on Israel, with US officials briefing the press about Israeli involvement.
So, based on those background briefings to the press, there is strong reason to suspect both Israeli and possibly even U.S. involvement, given the very public pronouncements of U.S. officials that they will use this time between the end of the Trump administration and the beginning of the Biden administration to do whatever they can to punish Iran and to set back Iran's progress in the nuclear field and other fields as well.
Fakhrizadeh had been on a UN Security Council list of sanctioned individuals. Iran had never allowed him to be interviewed by the International Atomic Agency. His whereabouts were also kept secret. The killing will also raise questions about the country's internal security.
Iranian officials are already vowing to respond, while saying their nuclear program will continue. But the timing of this assassination comes when Iran is waiting for President-elect Joe Biden to return the US to the 2015 nuclear deal, a treaty intended to keep Iran's nuclear program peaceful. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh is the most senior and crucial scientist killed to date. This threatens to complicate any future talks and further increase tensions in the region.
Despite some clashes between demonstrators and police, this protest in Paris was largely peaceful. Thousands of people gathered in the centre of the city to rally against part of a planned law that would crack down on people's freedom to film and publish images of police on duty. The French government says it would protect the identity of police officers. Those here say it's an erosion of rights.
It's important not to let this law pass because it would destroy our freedom to inform, especially when we're seeing lots of police violence. And even if those officers are a minority, it is too much.
This authoritarian trend is pushing us to say to the government, they must stop and change direction and let the police force know that there are these red lines.
The protest comes just days after the broadcast of this shocking video. A black music producer brutally beaten by police. And earlier in the week, an inquiry was opened after some officers were filmed beating migrants and journalists as police cleared a migrant camp. Without such videos, people here say some police officers could act with impunity.
It's not only these protesters that are angry about the law. A number of MPs and senators have also expressed concern, and even the UN's Human Rights Council has called on France to protect freedoms, and all that is putting a lot of pressure on the French government.
The crisis prompted French President Emmanuel Macron to post a message on social media. He condemned the recent images of police violence and urged his government to propose solutions to restore public confidence in the police force and protect rights. But those here say unless the government scraps the law's controversial clause, they will continue to protest.
These demonstrations in June were related to an event that had happened 3 years earlier, which had no judicial outcome and was a long process, but there was not the kind of immediate emotion of something that has happened almost under our eyes. And in a very tense context, you know, we are in a very special moment in France. The government is trying to push for a security law, which is raising lots of concern, lots of opposition. And all of a sudden you have in the same week 2 incidents of police violence, which are really creating a political problem. And I think you have different interpretations. Some people think that President Macron has allowed his Minister of Interior to give a free hand to the police because he wants to gain votes on the right. I think it might also be a problem of incompetence, that the authorities in charge of controlling the police or of commanding the police are just incompetent, and the police feel they have a free hand because there's not the political reining in that is needed in situations like that. And I think that's a very, very difficult political moment, and if there's no solution, it might get worse.
Might get worse. So two scenarios there spelled out. And again, as Pierre was saying, it's all happening the same week as the lower house of parliament approved a security bill, a draft bill for now, one that would broaden law enforcement powers and restrict the right to film police. Has the Emmanuel Macron, who served under a socialist government, ran as a centrist, taken a right turn? Or Vivian Walt, is this, as Pierre suggests, possibly incompetency in the hierarchy of the police?
I think this can be answered in one word. 2022, the next election. Macron is clearly feeling the heat from the right wing. He thinks that's going to be his big challenge. And he's clearly tilted to the right. There's just no doubt about it. It's been, very evident since he appointed his new prime minister and government. And I think what's worrying is actually the element of the security law that would stop people from distributing images of police officers. This really, I think, got under the skin of a lot of people, including, of course, us journalists. But more than that, it just seems to give police impunity, and we would not know about them beating up this music producer this week had it not been for videos that were captured. I just want to say one other thing, and since you mentioned Kylian Mbappe, that we should not forget that the US superstar Megan Rapinoe actually months ago called on Kylian Mbappe to come out and speak out about Black Lives Matter, and was asking where France's, athletes were in this whole debate. It's taken a while, and perhaps it's taken this incident this week to really shake people into speaking out.
Using their tractors to remove police barricades, farmers rode victoriously on their way to the capital region of Delhi. For 3 days, tens of thousands of farmers from the states of Punjab and Haryana pushed barricades, shipping containers, and even trucks out of their way. Tear gas, water cannon, and being hit by police batons didn't stop the farmers from continuing on their march called Let's Go to Delhi.
Farmers across the country want these black laws brought by the government to be repealed. This is our demand.
Farmers are against 3 new laws which allow private companies to buy directly from them. They say the changes will see the end of the government's guaranteed minimum price for their produce and leave them at the mercy of large corporations. Around half of India's 1.3 billion people work in the agriculture sector. Many agree that it needs reforms, but they say these laws won't benefit farmers. After trying to stop the march for days, Delhi police made a concession.
After discussion with farmer leaders, Delhi police has allowed them to hold peaceful protest at Nirankari ground in Buradi. We appeal to them to maintain peace.
But most farmers didn't take up that offer.
We'll block the highway until the government comes to talk to us. We will block the highway here. Who will listen to us there in New Delhi? They'll make us sit somewhere and no one will come to talk to us.
Hours after Delhi police assigned an area for protests on the outskirts of the city, few farmers showed up, even as their supporters set up a food stall to feed them. There is a large police presence here waiting for the farmers, and just as large a presence beyond this area to stop farmers from reaching central Delhi in what have been the biggest protests since the onset of the coronavirus pandemic.
We did have multiple tornado warnings last night, as we mentioned, as those severe storms moved through. The National Weather Service now confirms a tornado did touch down in Arlington, where we spotted a lot of damage. We know 3 people were taken to the hospital with minor injuries, and dozens of families have been displaced. Much of the mess is near the Burger Box on South Cooper Street, and that's where Nicole is live this morning. And Nicole, I know that I know this area. I'm very familiar with it, and I know that they had just finished remodeling that Burger Box, I would say within the last several weeks, maybe a month or so. And now, looking at the damage behind you, I mean, it looks all but destroyed.
Absolutely, Karen. The damage here is definitely widespread, from metal strewn about to this building almost completely damaged.
We were just putting our skateboards back in the car, and we got inside the car because like some dust or wind came here. So we got in the car and it started raining. We pushed us all the way up in the car, and the car started shaking.
The storms made a mess of several areas in Arlington. The heavy rain weakened some roofs and caused several to partially collapse at apartments, a commercial building, and churches. That's according to the Arlington Fire Department, who responded to several emergency calls. There were also several reports of gas leaks in the area. The Burger Box damage speaks for itself. You can see some planters were blown over and the sign completely destroyed. Patrick Harris found himself right in the middle of it.
I was just sitting there ordering like double meat cheeseburgers, some ice cream. With a little rain going on, you know what I'm saying? And they just all of a sudden just crashed down on them. Yeah. They never seen nothing like that before.
And we have seen Arlington police officers driving around, making sure everything is okay in this area. They do tell me, as you mentioned, Karen, there have been reports of minor injuries, but fortunately nothing too serious. Now we're live in Arlington this morning. Nicole Jacobs. Karen, back into you.
Yeah, that is the good news, Nicole. Thank you. People living at the Water Dance apartments not far from there do have a lot of cleanup ahead of them. The damage is extensive, as you can see. Part of the roof here was blown off one building and then slammed into the building beside it. Other units just down from those look pretty much the same. A lot of windows are shattered, doors blown in. We spoke to some people living there shortly after it happened, and they say the whole thing caught them by surprise.
It was all over within like 30 seconds.
It was quick. I had just pulled up. Trying to get out. They said it was a tornado. But who knows?
The good news, residents tell us they think everyone was able to get out safely. Arlington Fire Department says 75 families in those 3 apartment buildings, including Waterdance, or apartment complexes, I should say, including Waterdance, are displaced this morning. Now, a little more than a mile from there, crews taped off some businesses on Colorado Lane. It looks as if some of the awnings blew off the building, smashed into cars in the parking lot. If your morning commute takes you in this area, just be extra cautious on the roads. Lieutenant Richard Fagan, a spokesman for the Arlington Fire Department, spoke with us during our 10 o'clock newscast last night, shortly after the storms passed through. Their crews spent much of the night assessing the damage, and they say 7 buildings have collapsed.
Some of these, as they get on scene, they're reported as partial collapses. It could be roofs, it could be walls bulging, or roofs sagging, and it could be in awnings. But as they come in, there is a threat, and they must be assessed.
If you do come across anything, be sure to alert authorities and don't get close to the damage. Down power lines could still be live, and some structures may still be unstable.
ප්‍රතිචක්‍රීකරණය කටයුතු ඒ පළාත් පාලන ආයතන සිදු කරනවා. මේ තත්ත්වය නිසා වනයේ අභ්‍යන්තරයේ සිටින වනාලින් 30 40 50 එක විට අපිට දැක ගන්න පුළුවන් මේ කසල චක්‍රීයකරණ ආයතනවල.
මේකට ක්‍රමයක් වැඩපිළිවෙලක් නැහැ. නගර සභාව, ගම් සභාව මේවා එකතු වෙන කසල බැහැර කරන්නට සූදානම් කරලා තියෙන්නේ. අබේ භූමිය තුලට තමයි. අබේ භූමිය තුලට කසල බැහැර කරන ස්ථානය හැදුවට පස්සේ ඒකට පැමිණෙන වනාලි, වන සත්තු මේ කසල අනුභව කරලා මිය යනවා. එසා අපි මේකට විවිධ පර්යේෂණ කරනවා. උදාහරණයක් විදිහට මේ අලි අගල් ක්‍රමේ සාර්ථකයි කියලා අපි දැන් විශ්වාස කරනවා. එක ක්‍රමයක්. ඊළඟට මොන්රාගල දිස්ත්‍රික්කයේ සමහර තැන්වල විවිධ පර්යේෂණ කරමින් තියෙනවා. මේ හේතුවෙන් අලි මිනිස් ගැටුම තවත් උග්‍ර වෙලා තියෙනවා. කසල අනුභව කරන්නට එන අලි, ඒ කසල කොටට එන අලි දිවා රාත්‍රී දෙක මෙතන ගැවසෙනවා. ඊට පස්සේ වටේ තියෙන ගොවි බිම් වලට, ගම්මාන වලට වැදිලා මිනිස් ජීවිතවලට, ඒ වගේම මිනිසුන්ගේ දේපල වලට, වගා බිම් වලට හානි කරනවා. මේක තාමත් අදබල ප්‍රශ්නයක් වෙලා තියෙන්නේ. ජනතාව අලි මිනිස් ගැටුමට වඩා මේ කසල හේතුවෙන් අපේ රටේ සම්පතක් විදියට හඳුන්වන අලි සම්පත විශාල වශයෙන් විනාශ වෙලා යනවා.